Hey everyone, this is producer Hamilton with Making the Argument with Nick Freitas. Well, Nick is in his last week of session. We have an excellent episode for you, brought to you by Good Ranchers, of course. And now I'm going to hand it over to Tina Freitas and Christian Hines to get right into the episode.
Okay, everybody. So here we are. We just had Super Tuesday, and Nikki Haley dropped out. And we thought it might be a good idea to kind of discuss what happens about 10 months from now, depending on who actually wins this thing. We've got our nominee. We've got Trump, obviously. I think we still have to go through all the rigmarole of primary season, but it's him. And obviously it's Biden. I'm going to have to eat my words because I was saying originally that I thought they would trade him out for Newsom by now, and they have not done that. And so I'm not really sure what they're thinking right now, but they're holding on to him. And so we're going to kind of discuss a little bit today about what a second term of Biden and a second term of Trump might look like, depending on who wins, and sort of explore a little bit of, if this one wins under these circumstances or that one wins under those circumstances, how is everybody going to react? So we're going to talk about all of that today on this episode. And also with us today is Christian Hines, Master Hines.
And we're also going to talk about one final thing. We're going to close on something that I think is going to be relatively interesting about what do we think is going to happen regardless of who ends up winning this thing. Because I think that there's a really clear contrast between Trump and Biden, but there's some things that we've hinted at on this podcast in previous episodes that we think is going to take place no matter who ends up in the White House. So you got to stick around for the end for that, because I think it'll be a really fun way to wrap up this episode. With that said, unfortunately, without us today is Nick Freitas, who's currently doing the people's business in Richmond, trying
it's
to fight.
His last week, though.
I know. He'll be back. What? Hamilton, you got to tell us. Is he going to be back in the next podcast, or is it going to be the one after that?
As far as I'm aware, he will be back in the studio for the next podcast.
It's a lot of transition time. We don't know if Virginia's going to get that budget out, and if they don't, they could go in a longer session. But it kind of looks like they're going to get it, even though it's a crappy budget. So all that to say, let's go ahead and get going. We'll have Nick in the studio next week, and so we're going to start with our very first kind of question. This little bit of a thought exercise. How do you think the right will react if Biden versus Trump turns out to be Biden with an actual real win? Like, it's obvious he really won.
So in our introduction, we were hinting at something that took place last night, right? Like, we had Super Tuesday. Nikki Haley lost everything other than Vermont, right? And she ended up dropping out of the race. So now it's obvious that it's going to be a rematch between the two of those. And I know so many people for so long were predicting something other than a rematch. And if we end up with another rematch and Biden wins one way or the other, I do think that you're going to see a continued increase in polarization, in part because of actually something that Nick talked about in the previous podcast. In our previous podcast, I brought up a point, and then Nick elaborated on it in way better words than I ever could have, where I was arguing that, look, it's not, white nationalism or Christian nationalism or rural rage or whatever these terms are that the left-wing media are throwing out. That's not what the problem is. The problem is that Democrats are radicalizing people against them. They're pushing the envelope way too far.
They are, and they're totally doubling down. I don't know if you saw the article today come out about Rachel... What is her
Rachel
name?
Maddow?
Yeah, and the other one, I don't. They all look the same to me. They're all like shims or something. But anyway, they're sitting there making fun of Virginia, rural voters in Virginia.
Oh, I know.
GOP voters, for worrying about the border crisis. Mm-hmm. Basically, like, why do you care? You're so far from the border. Why do they even care? You know what
they said? They said, I don't know what they're concerned about other than our border with West Virginia. So it was like a double insult, right? It was like mocking the idea that voters would be concerned about immigration. And it was like the only border Virginia should care about is with West Virginia, with those ignorant hillbilly hicks over there.
Well, it's almost as if we're not, all of these states care about what happens on our border. It's almost like saying, well, you don't have any right to worry about the Texas's border or Arizona's border, even though it's our federal border. I mean, we all have a right to care about it.
What I find so funny about that is that those same people conveniently ignore the fact that, well, apparently Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City, cares about the immigration problem because he's done a complete 180 on that issue since tens of thousands of illegal immigrants have been bussed into New York City.
I feel like that was such a good move by some of these governors.
It was.
To finally make the problem more, just present the problem to them a little bit more personally, so that they have to actually address the issue too, because they're not paying attention to the fact that, like, you've got tens of thousands of people pouring over a border, which comes into basically a rural town. I mean, that's overwhelming. New York City, this massive city, can't even handle a few thousand being bussed in. And you've got these rural towns along the border having to deal with all of this. So making it their problem, I think that was a pretty good move.
So back to your question about, like, what would be the right's reaction if Biden won?
Yeah.
I'll start with the immigration thing since you brought it up. Like, I think that the strategy that you've seen states like Florida and Texas and a couple others as well, but mostly Florida and Texas employ, of busing illegal immigrants or flying illegal immigrants to blue state America or blue city America, I think that's only going to ramp up if you get a second Biden term, in part because we know that there's an incentive. In fact, Elon Musk actually tweeted this like the other day, or maybe even less than a day ago. He tweeted that, like, it's not hard for you to, like, connect the dots. He literally said, the reason that we have an open border right now, the reason that we have an immigration crisis is because they think it's politically advantageous for themselves. They want to have this trump card hanging in the background, waiting for an opportunity to try to get amnesty, because they have concluded, rightly or wrongly, but they've concluded that if you're able to get amnesty, the majority of these people will vote for them. It's as simple as that. It's a simple, raw, cynical approach to partisan politics. And I think that the response from the right is going to be continuing what we've seen over the last 4 years, which is things like busing of illegal immigrants to places like Los Angeles, Denver, Chicago, New York City, Baltimore, Washington, D.C.
Do you think that Biden administration would, as we know, he has weaponized the DOJ against his political opponents. Do you think we might see something happen like that with some of these governors who keep on doing the busing? What do you think? What tools does he have to stop them from doing that?
So he has lawfare for sure, right? He can go to the court system. He can sick the DOJ.
I mean, except for, you've got Governor Abbott, who's like, I don't care what the Supreme Court says. We're still putting up razor wire. So do you think that'll work?
I think you'll definitely get like a potential constitutional showdown between a state like Texas or Florida and the federal government. But, like, so for example, here's an article that you actually sent me, Tina, which was judges improperly enhanced sentences of more than 100 January 6 rioters, appeal court rules.
Yeah, and it was a unanimous decision, and it was a leftist appeals court that ruled that.
And the reason that you sent this over and that I wanted to include it in this podcast is because, and this is kind of tied into the immigration problem, because you see the federal government going after states like Texas, again, using lawfare in order to do so. But it's more than just that. If you see a second Biden term, you're going to see an explosion of, again, federal law enforcement, the ATF, the DOJ, the FBI, all the alphabet agencies, right? The alphabet boys, they're going to be unleashed on conservative America even more than they already have been, in part because Biden will feel vindicated. And since he won't have a re-election to worry about, there's no need to restrain yourself or anything like that, because there is no re-election to look forward to. It's your second term.
I mean, if he does do that, though, gosh, if that did happen, do you think we could have like an interposition situation?
Well, that's why I said that I think that you're going to end up with a constitutional crisis, because you already had one. Like, we did a podcast that was one of our best performing podcasts of all time, where we talked about how the Supreme Court ruled that, the U.S. border is unconstitutional. It was a bit of a tongue-in-cheek title, but there was some truth behind it when the court decided to side with the federal government against Texas. And then Texas's response was, we're going to continue to do this anyway, right? It was a soft version of, the Supreme Court has made its ruling, now let it enforce it. I think that you're going to see that ramped up to 11, because the Democrats are so utterly convinced, and this gets back into the previous episode. If you have not watched the previous podcast and you're watching today's, I highly recommend that you go back and you watch the previous podcast, either after this episode or, quite frankly, at this point, stop this one and go back to the previous one and then come back to this. And the reason why is because there's so many things that Nick covered in that podcast, and quite frankly, that myself and Tina covered as well, that I'm very worried will end up repeating themselves in a hypothetical second Biden situation, especially on the law enforcement side, because these people are so utterly convinced that we're the problem, that we're the evil guys, that we're the bad guys, we're the threat to democracy. If you live in rural America and you're white,
and it's not just rural and white, it's also if you're Christian, if you're
a Christian nationalist,
right? Exactly, and you even see the FBI. I read another article about gosh, I can't remember if he was a priest or what, but he was basically dragged out of his service by the FBI on these weird charges of intent to, do something with wire transfers or whatever. And of course the charges were all completely dropped, and now they're, oh, well, it was a mistake. Well, I'm sorry, but you've got like all these FBI whistleblowers now talking about the fact that they're placing FBI agents in certain parishes and stuff in order to collect information on the off chance, I guess, that maybe there might be some kind of a plot going on. Like maybe we as Christian, on the Christian side of the spectrum, maybe we're like some kind of domestic terrorist now.
Oh, they already, I mean, I remember the days of when federal law enforcement were saying things like, if you have a Ron Paul bumper sticker, you're suspect, right? If you support things like abolishing the Federal Reserve, or you want to drastically cut, the size of the federal government, like you're a potential domestic terrorist. Like, and more recently, do you remember that court case where it was these guys in Michigan were charged with all these things about this like kidnapping plot for the Democratic governor up there, and then the trial happened and the jury ended up ruling that like, no, these guys were entrapped by federal agents that actually orchestrated the entire thing.
They created the whole plan and tried to get everybody on board with their plan, and
then used it as a justification to arrest these people and try to throw them in prison for decades. And again, what would you not do if you hold democracy at the pinnacle, if you hold voting at the pinnacle of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that's the equivalent of self-actualization. The left does. The left truly thinks that there's nothing greater that you can do as an individual, nothing more you can achieve as an individual than to vote for them. That is that is the pinnacle of self-actualization in their minds. If you hold that view, and if you hold this view that democracy is basically a divine entity, and if you also hold the view that we are a threat to democracy and that we are a threat to everything that they hold dear and that we're evil, what would you not do to preserve these things that you view as almost like that you have this like pseudo-religious worship towards?
Yes.
And I think that is the danger here. Excuse me. I think that's the danger here, is that this mindset that my enemies are basically borderline fascists. And actually, if you think that that's an exaggeration, I've got something for you here. So we're talking about hypothetical plans that Biden could try to pursue if he gets reelected. And we're also going to talk about hypothetical plans about Trump. Well, here's what like the normie sources have to say. And we get dinged whenever we do this. I want to tell the audience this is intentional. I'm doing this on purpose. I'm aware this is not a reliable source. And I know it's not a reliable source because I have over 20,000 Wikipedia edits. But here's what Wikipedia has to say. And then I'll show you a link from the Associated Press as well, which is also a very normie center-left news outlet. Here's what Wikipedia has to say about Biden's 2024 campaign and what he wants to run on. And yes, I understand this is biased. I understand this is not reliable. I understand it's Wikipedia. I'm doing it on purpose because I'm trying to show people this is what the general public is being shown about the plans that Biden has. So it talks about like the number one thing that Biden wants to focus on is democracy. Here's his platform, right? It focuses on democracy, social services and healthcare, abortion. the fact that those are his 3 things that he wants to focus on are kind of hilarious. But like the whole democracy thing, it goes on to say that, Biden has frequently called to attention Trump's former attempts to overturn the election and the culmination of the January 6th attack. And he described it as a coup d'etat or a self-coup, and that, he's a destroyer and a real threat to democracy. Like they are pushing this narrative so hard because this is what they want to run on. And it's not just what they want to run on because they think that they'll get elected or reelected because of it. They want to run on this because they intend to pursue this if they get reelected. If Biden gets back into the White House, he's going to use the mud democracy excuse to target his political opponents because there's nothing more democratic, apparently, than to politically target your opposition.
Right. And we've already established through, our previous podcast, we've already established that he's willing to weaponize everything he's got. I mean, even under Obama, we had the IRS weaponized, although I feel like the IRS is kind of weaponized against all of us at this point. But and if you question that, then look at how many IRS agents are supposed to be of the military sort or policing sort. But one of the things that we were going to also cover in this is what the right would do if he won, by normal means. Like, let's say he really won with enough of a margin to where we knew it was not stolen. Do you think the right would flip out and cause a civil war and do all of that?
You're talking about Biden, right?
Biden.
Well, okay, so I showed you the Wikipedia page on Biden's campaign and his platform. Here's the contrast of what they have to say about Trump, which really goes to expose like the rank hypocrisy that you see, again, in places that the left is ideologically captured. And as a former Wikipedia editor myself, again, I had like 20,000 edits, mostly about history-related topics. I tried to avoid political topics on purpose. Here's what they have to say about Trump. They immediately open up with, oh, he wants to massively expand the power of the federal government. No, he doesn't. He wants to massively destroy the federal bureaucracy. And then they conclude with like, oh, his violent rhetoric and dehumanizing behavior and his authoritarian and anti-democratic statements. And they mention like, questions about, whether or not he's a fascist. Like if you search for the term fascist in here, it appears 8 times in the article. Like the reason that I'm bringing this up is because what I want to get across to people is they're broadcasting their intentions on what they want to run on and what they want to do in the form of how they paint both candidates, what they're running on, and what their intentions are. And so the reason that I'm showing these like Wikipedia links here, and here's the same thing from the Associated Press, the reason that I'm showing these, again, like normie sources that have a very strong left-wing bias is because I want to show the audience that they're being very transparent as to what their intention is, what they want to talk about in this campaign cycle, and what they want to do if they get elected, regardless of the margin. It could be a Florida 2000 situation.
Yeah.
And that would be very interesting. Honestly, that would deserve an entire separate podcast of like, what would a Florida 2000 situation look like if the entire election came down to 5,000 or 500 votes, not even 5,000, 500 votes in Pennsylvania or Michigan.
Right.
Because that could literally trigger a constitutional crisis. And I mean, that would take forever to explain. But even if that's not the case, even if he wins convincingly, and quite frankly, I don't think he will win convincingly.
I don't either, but we're kind of exploring, like, is the right going to flip out and do all of this stuff? If you look at what the left is sort of prepping the objective on, they're preparing to, even if the right just goes about their lives after a solid Biden win. We probably mostly go about our lives. We all grumble a little bit. We're kind of mad. We're frustrated or whatever. But I think the left really needs us to lose our crap. They need us to like go ballistic so that they can implement their threat to democracy plan.
I think that you will see remember what I said in the previous podcast, that the problem is not rural rage. It's not white men in rural America. It's not Christian nationalism. It's none of these buzzwords that they've thrown around increasingly. Like they're writing whole books about white rural rage. That's not the problem. The problem is that people are becoming radicalized against Democrats. If they get into the White House again, if Biden wins again, and it's not even they at this point, like we know it's going to be Biden barring some black swan event. If they get into the White House again, you're going to see the radicalization continue. And as Nick pointed out in the previous podcast, they're going to say, see, we warned you. These people are fascists. They're threats to democracy. No, you did not warn them. You did not warn the general public about this happening. You created the problem.
Yeah.
You made these people radicalized through your own policies. I think you're going to see more Whitmer situations. I think you're going to see more situations like that thing in Michigan. I think you could potentially see another January 6th type situation, except I think what's going to happen is more and more and more, you're going to see the right falling for instances of entrapment. I think that federal law enforcement is going to continue to wield itself as a weapon against conservative America.
I kind of think that's a lot more okay. I think we're talking sort of on two different planes, because I think the mindset of the right is so right now, in my opinion, I think Trump has a much higher chance of winning than Biden does at this point. He's so underwater. And I know that a lot can change between now and then. However, so most of us feel like there is no way Biden will win again. So if he does win again, we're automatically thinking something shady is going on, right? And so even if nothing shady did happen, which I don't think that's possible, but if nothing shady did happen, I think we'd still be thinking, this still doesn't pass the sniff test with everything leading up to it that he would win again. But I think where you have people on the right really losing their minds is if Biden were to win as a result of what looks to be fraud. And I think that is what we are most triggered by. And I think that is where this whole plan gets heavily implemented, and you start getting way more radicalized people against him.
Oh, if it's a Florida 2000 situation.
Yeah.
And Biden ends up in the White House as a consequence of however that plays out, which again is arguably a whole entire separate podcast of what would happen in such a scenario. Because we are not the America that we were in 2000.
No.
Like I would actually
And we're not going back. We can't go back to
Go
that.
back and watch the concession speech that Al Gore gave at the end of the 2000 election. Now, granted, he litigated this in the courts for over a month, and tried to have recount after recount after recount in Florida. And then eventually the Supreme Court stopped. It was like the fifth separate recount, and then he stopped it. And, so, it wasn't like he was gracious up until that point, right? But when it was said and done, and the Supreme Court made its ruling and stopped the last recount in Florida, which gave the win to Bush, go and watch that concession speech from Al Gore. Al Gore sounds like a Republican today in that concession speech. The Democratic Party of 2000 does not exist anymore. But guess what?
If
the Republican Party of 2000.
Any Democrat from 2000 sounds like today's Republicans.
Yeah, well, that's my point.
Yeah.
And so like this idea that we'll just come together and sing Kumbaya and rally around and, move forward, I don't think that will happen, in part because the right is starting to realize, there was a phrase that Nick told me once that, for a long time, the right felt like that the left were misguided and wrong, and the left felt like the right were evil, and that was the difference in approach. But increasingly, we're getting to a point where the right is concluded the exact same thing about the left that the left has concluded about the right, which is why you're seeing more radicalization. So regardless of the margin that Biden wins by, I think that the end result is still going to be more division, more polarization, more radicalization.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think that continues no matter who gets
I was about to say, I actually think that continues no matter who, because if Trump gets into the White House, we already know in many respects what he wants to do, and that's going to
hold on. Let me
them.
ask the question, because we did Biden. Let's flip the coin now and go over to what if Trump, okay? Because what do you think, how do you think the left is going to react, in my opinion, when Trump wins? And this time we're kind of looking at, he might even win, he'll probably win the popular vote and the Electoral College at this point, not just the Electoral College. What do you think the left's going to do? And I'll remind you that back in 2016, the left was losing their minds. They were throwing bricks through windows. They were setting police cars on fire. Women like Madonna were standing out there talking about, fantasizing about assassinating, the president. all of this was going on. You had these women marches with the pink hats. I don't know if y'all remember, they decorated these big, vagina suits and everything else and like marched the streets. And you didn't just have rioting in DC. You had it all over the country and it was violent. Okay, so we talk about the January 6th stuff, but the left went after private businesses, private people. They didn't even go after the government. They went after private folks, So knowing what happened then, how much more unhinged do you think they'll be this time? Especially if he doesn't win the popular vote and only gets the Electoral College. I mean, what do you think the left will do?
All right, but the craziest poll that I've seen recently was the one that I just conducted with myself, which said that Good Ranchers is the best out there, and you really got to go to goodranchers.com right now, put in promo code Nick, sign up for one of their subscriptions, because on top of getting the best American-raised beef, poultry, pork, wild-caught seafood, right? You sign up for the subscription now, you put in promo code Nick, you're going to get a free 10-pound Easter ham with that subscription. That's pretty hard to beat because, again, you need to understand something. When you go to the grocery store, right, and you're buying your meat products and you see a little American flag on there, you're probably thinking that pig, that cow, that chicken, whatever it is, was raised here in the United States. Not necessarily. You would be shocked at what they're permitted to put on beef and other meat products that says product of the United States, when in reality it was raised in a feedlot in a different country. So if you want, again, quality American-raised meats, ones that don't have a bunch of like crazy mRNA vaccines and things like that, go to goodranchers.com, put in promo code Nick, sign up for one of those subscriptions, get yourself a free 10-pound Easter ham to go with it, right? I promise you're not going to regret it. Goodranchers.com, go and check it out.
Okay, so now to get back to your question about what would actually happen if somebody like Trump gets into the White
How
House.
the left will respond.
Yes, how the left will respond. So we've already seen it, right?
Yeah.
We saw it in 2016.
Right.
And I just want to point out, because this myth just will not die. This idea that Republicans are, like fascists that hate democracy and want to install a strongman dictator. Like, I'm sorry, and that they're the only ones that want to overturn elections. I'm sorry, but it was only Democrats that tried to stop the 2000 election. It was only Democrats that tried to overturn the 2004 election. Go and look at the 2004 election. There were Democrats in the House that voted against certifying Ohio's electoral votes.
Wow.
There were Democrats, obviously, we all remember what they did in 2016. They even tried to rig the Electoral College. Remember the whole Hamilton electors thing where they tried to get Republicans and Democrats electors to vote for somebody else other than Trump in 2016
Yep.
after the election was over? So this idea that, and then we did a podcast on Tuesday, our previous podcast, where we talked about how there's an entire plot going on right now where they're openly broadcasting what they want to do, where it's like, if Democrats have a majority within the state state delegations to the House of Representatives that certify the election on January 6th, they want to refuse certification if Trump wins the Electoral College. And they're in a position to do so. So
the very thing they accuse Republicans of
which was
trying
the
to do.
stated goal of the January 6th protesters. The whole reason that January 6th happened, and I don't just mean the events in the Capitol, I also mean the whole reason people went to D.C. and did their constitutionally protected exercise, their constitutionally protected rights, and this is something that the left leaves out. It is a constitutionally protected right for people to go and protest their government, right? The problem with January 6th is people vandalizing things and breaking things and illegally entering the Capitol. But even then, we've seen instances of people being invited into the Capitol. Like Norm Macdonald, God bless him. I miss him so much. Norm Macdonald actually joked about how my favorite part about this violent insurrection was when the protesters walked between the velvet ropes inside the Capitol. So like there were a lot of people there on January 6th that didn't do anything illegal, that didn't do anything that deserved being prosecuted against. All they wanted to do was
they're calling
protest.
it an insurrection, but isn't it actually a legal mechanism to overturn?
Technically it's a legal mechanism for the House of Representatives
So it's
to refuse
not
certification.
insurrection to try to get them to do that.
What the left argues is that these people were trying to intimidate Congress into giving them their outcome, which you can run with that argument only if you're willing to say, okay, so is it also the same thing? Is it also a coup or a self-coup or a, overthrow of our democracy if Democrats do the exact same thing? Because again, this is my whole point. The stated goals of the January 6th protesters was for states to reject the electors for Congress via the state delegations, to reject the electors from these states that they claimed had been rigged or were fraudulent or whatever, right? So like Georgia, the states that were very close, that were decided by like a couple tens of thousands of votes. So Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin being the big ones. And the thing is that, again, based on our last podcast, that's exactly the same thing that Democrats are putting on their own ideologically captured websites, the ideologically captured press that are being water-carrying allies for the Democratic Party right now, like The Atlantic, like the Daily Beast. They're saying this is something that Democrats can do to stop Trump from getting into the White House. So it's an exact double standard. Now, the sad thing is it doesn't matter if you call it out as a double standard because they've already cloaked themselves with the, we're defenders of democracy and we're the evil fascists that want to institute a dictatorship. So it doesn't matter that I try to bring up the fact that, wow, imagine if the roles were reversed, or wow, this is an act of hypocrisy. They don't care that it's hypocritical, right? They've already declared themselves to be the good guys and we're the bad guys, and therefore they can be justified in doing anything they want against us because we're the bad guys. Right. And so, yes,
but if you call somebody the bad guy enough and you have no path to redemption from being the bad guy, short of if you're a white straight male, you better freaking put on a skirt and a wig and maybe get some implants, and then maybe you get redemption in the left. But at that point, you give people nowhere to go, and there is a point where people go, if I'm going to be accused of this, I'm just going to do it.
It's the let me be evil trope. And I don't think that everybody's going to end up going down that route, although I do think there's a danger.
Well, not even necessarily being evil. Not even.
Well, I said it's a trope.
But what I'm saying is there are a lot of people where they don't want to do anything illegal or like morally wrong. But there's a lot of people who don't speak up now and who allow themselves to be called things and they just push past it without and don't offer any resistance. Those are the people where I don't necessarily think they're all going to go and become criminals or go and
No, I don't think so
They're not
either.
going to go burn your local Democrat's house down. They're not going to do stuff like that. But they will start pushing back. They will start reporting things at work. They will start saying, no, I'm not going to shut up. I'm not going to be, shouted down anymore. I am going to stand up for myself. And so I do look forward to that side. I hope a lot of people do that. And I think that'll be the overwhelming majority of the people will wake up in that sense.
A more positive way to portray this, because I painted a dark picture, and that's the dark side of the right that I've tried to warn about ever since we did our right-wing backlash episode last year. But I don't think everybody's going to go down that path where they're like, well, I guess I will become a fascist because the left says that I already am one. No, I think that a minority of people are going to go down that route. What I think the vast majority of ordinary conservatives, and Nick has brought this up repeatedly, I don't want to hurt anybody. I don't want to impose my will on anybody. I don't want to replace left-wing strongman authoritarianism with right-wing strongman authoritarianism. That's not my goal. My goal is to defend the Constitution. My goal is to defend individual liberty. My goal is to defend the principles and values that made the United States what it is. And the United States became what it is not through strongman authoritarianism, not through fascism. The left are the ones that have adopted more fascist policies. Look at their economic approach.
Right.
Nick has talked about this at length. I think that the vast majority of conservatives are not going to, regardless of how Biden wins, if he does, and regardless of the margin, I don't think the vast majority of conservatives are going to go down the route of, well, I guess we're just going to become the caricature that the left paints us at. What I think that the vast majority of conservatives are going to go down is something that Jonam told me when I went to the UK. Jonam is a longtime listener of the podcast. He's actually been on the show. Nick interviewed him. Jonam told me when I was over in the UK getting my master's degree and graduating, I had the opportunity to meet him in person, and we got lunch together, and it was a fantastic conversation. I enjoyed every minute of it. And he said something that really resonated with me that I think does a better job of explaining the direction that I think conservatives are going to go than the let me be evil trope.
Right.
And he said, and he's talking about the left, and he's talking about wokeism and these pseudo-religions that are popping up to fill the void that Christianity is unfortunately leaving behind right now. And he told me, it doesn't matter that you think, that I'm a villain in your story because you're a clown in mine.
Oh.
And I think that's the approach that conservatives are going to take, which is they're going to stand up and they're going to be like, you're not going to punch me anymore.
Yeah.
That's over. That's done with. You have sicked federal law enforcement on me. You've sicked all of the institutions that you've ideologically captured on me. You've turned into gatekeepers.
Yeah.
By the way, that should be a whole nother podcast. Look at like hobbies and industries and things that people used to be involved in. And the left has captured them all and turned into gatekeepers. Like, again, I brought up Wikipedia earlier. I used to be a prolific Wikipedia editor. It was a hobby of mine. I had just all this random knowledge, and nobody ever cared about it in real life, so I would go on the internet and add it to it. And then I realized that this site is being taken over by left-wing ideological zealots who do not tolerate any other viewpoint but their own. So I stopped editing it. You see the same thing with Reddit, where left-wing ideological zealots captured Reddit, took over most of the subreddits there, made themselves mods, and then expelled anybody that doesn't parrot the line. If you go to any normal subreddit, like r/politics or anything like that, it's all left-wing propaganda. Look at most hobbies like the gaming industry. Over the last decade or so, you've seen the same thing. Look at entertainment. We've talked about Hollywood, and
they've
really also turned into gatekeepers there.
They have ruined the entertainment.
I think that conservatives are going to be like, I'm done with the gatekeeping.
Yeah.
I'm done with you hijacking everything that I used to be interested in,
Yeah.
or worked in, or had a hobby in, and then you would wield it as a weapon against me because I don't share the same values as you. Well, guess what? I don't care if you think I'm a villain. That's fantastic. I know I'm not a villain. I know I'm not evil. I know I'm not a fascist or a dictator or anything like that. You're just a lunatic, and I'm going to treat you like a lunatic. I think that is what you're going to see.
We're definitely past this point where we're like, no, I'm not that. I'm not. Wait, I didn't do what you said.
Yeah, I'm done apologizing.
We no longer defend ourselves. Now we're just going, yeah, we don't really care what you say. You're irrelevant to us now.
This is why I constantly say, and Nick and I get into arguments about this. This is why I constantly say the left are losers and lunatics. And then he gets upset with me when I bring up the left are losers because and to Nick's credit, what he's trying to say, and in some ways he's a much better person than me, because what he's trying to say is that, look, everybody is beautifully and wonderfully created. Everybody has that spark of divine inspiration in them because they're all created in the image of God. Everybody. Even my worst political enemies. And he wants to recognize that humanity that exists in everybody. Even the people that think that he's a bad guy, right? Even people that think, well, he's the problem because he's from a rural place and he's white, therefore he's a threat to democracy and he's all these terrible things. And I know Nick. I know what he believes and what he wants to do. Nick doesn't want to oppress anybody. Yeah. Despite the fact that the left has labeled him an oppressor. Why? Because of his race and gender and where he lives. Those are the only reasons that they and his religion. Those are the only reasons that the left labels somebody like Nick as an oppressor. But Nick is the least oppressive person of all time. But you know what? He's not weak.
No.
He's gone to war, and he's willing to defend himself. And he will stand up and defend himself and defend his family and defend his friends and defend the people that share his values. And people like him are going to stand up if somebody like Joe Biden gets back into the White House. But you brought up what happens if Trump wins. And I was hinting at earlier, well, we've already seen what the left does, because I brought up the 2000 situation and Al Gore.
I feel like we're going to get a lot more really good, like, GIFs. How do you say that? GIFs or GIFs?
Oh, man, there's a whole debate over that.
There is, but I call them
debate.
GIFs. But anyway, I can have entire conversations over GIF. It's my favorite thing. But let me just tell you, we're going to have so many good GIFs. Like, remember the lady that was just like, or the, I don't know if it was a lady or an it or what, but it was like, just like screaming no, like over and over again on hands and knees in this lime green jacket thing. Do you remember that?
Yeah,
and
I know exactly what you mean.
She's like this universal GIF now. And I feel like we're going to get so many more of those. It's going to be glorious.
Well, the resist libs will come back, right? Because apparently the people that already rule all of the institutions in this country. Who
Right.
knew that if the media,
They're so oppressed.
academia, Hollywood, Silicon Valley, Wall
Yeah.
Street, the entire federal federal bureaucracy and apparatus, the fourth estate, who knew that if every single aspect of corporate America
Yeah.
agreed with you on everything, somehow you're a member of the resistance. Like,
I think more
What a
of what we
joke.
have is leftist fragility here. It's they're so fragile. They can't handle it. They all have mental illness now. But let me ask you this, okay? I'm just going to pivot just a little bit and it's not listed on my questions here. I'm just curious what you think. Now, if Trump gets a second term, which I think he will, it's going to be different than the first term, I believe. I think he's going to be making good on a lot of promises that he wasn't able to finish up on because he didn't get that second term and COVID just threw everything on its ear. And there's a lot of things that I think he'll go ahead and make good on. However, there is a dynamic this time that doesn't exist anymore. And that is he won't be worried about a reelection. So how hard do you think he's going to lean into his agenda, and how much is he going to actually, like, there were times when he would try to go to the negotiating table with the left and try to get what he was after. What do you think he'll do this time? Do you think he will just kind of, I don't know, for lack of a better term, sort of strong arm it and just make it happen? Just like what do you think is going to happen as far as his agenda goes?
So
Without the worried about reelection dynamic.
I agree with you that it's going to be different than the first term, which is actually why I'm going to be voting for Trump this time. I brought it up and I got some pushback, and you know what? Fair enough. But I got a lot of pushback from people. I also got a lot of supportive comments that I saw from people that were like, well, I was shocked at how many people I know did not vote for Trump in 2020 that will crawl through broken glass to vote for him this time.
Well, you just did, right, on Tuesday? On Super Tuesday?
I did.
You went and voted for Trump.
I wish I had the picture in front of me. But yeah, I voted for Trump in the primary against Nikki Haley because I don't want another neocon back in there. This is not 2004. We do not need another Jeb Bush or George Bush or Mitt Romney as the Republican nominee. It's a different party, and I'm glad for it because I have strong differences with Trump on several issues. I mean, we've talked about that at length. Like, I don't agree with him on like the money printing and stuff like that. But I agree with somebody like Trump far more than I agree with somebody like Nikki Haley.
Well, let's just be honest. A Nikki Haley would print a lot of money too.
Oh, she would.
They all would.
She'd print a lot of money and send it to, Ukraine and Israel and NATO and again, like I understand why the United States needs to have friendly relations with other countries, but the United States should not exist as a tax farm for other nations, especially when we have an open border right now. And so anyway, to your point about like the difference. So that I agree with you that there's a difference. I agree with you that Trump 2024, if he wins, is a lot different than Trump 2020 when he was running for re-election the first time.
Do you think it's a good difference
and
or a
I
bad
think it's
difference?
a good
Yeah,
well,
me too.
I wouldn't think it's a good difference if I had voted for him, I wouldn't be thinking it's a good difference, right?
Right.
I might have gotten that screwed up, but you get what I mean.
I get what you mean.
like I wouldn't have voted for him if I thought it was a bad difference, right? And the whole reason I voted for him in this primary and fully intend to vote for him in this election when I didn't 4 years ago is because I'm looking forward to the stuff that Trump wants to do this time because Trump realizes who the enemy is. The enemy is not like Joe Biden. I'm sorry, but Joe Biden barely understands that he's even in the White House.
I'm pretty sure he doesn't.
And look, at the end of the day, Joe Biden is not the enemy. The enemy is the institutional capture that the left has engaged through the long march through the institutions, going back to the 60s, the 40s, arguably the progressive era in the 1910s and 20s for the last century. It's only ramped up since LBJ.
Right.
But, and certainly since FDR. But like, that's the enemy. The enemy is the leftist gatekeepers. The enemy is cultural Marxism. And
so what do you think Trump will do to combat that? Like, do you think, what recourse, what tools does the executive have to try to barrel through some of the roadblocks that the left can bring up? And obviously, a lot of this depends on if we get the House and the Senate, right?
Well, not everything, because here's where the interesting thing comes into play.
That's what I want to know. What can he do without him?
So remember when, and it's funny because it reminds me of what happened with Argentina, right? So Argentina went through exactly what I fear the United States could go through, certainly fiscally. But like Argentina was ruled by Peronists, which are basically the Argentinian equivalent of socialists. They were ruled by Peronists for decades, like over 50 years, basically. And they destroyed that country, like totally destroyed the country. Inflation went to like 200%. At one point, it was like 2,000% back in the 80s. It was more than that, actually. It was like 20,000%. Like poverty went through the roof. 40% of the country's impoverished. This is a country that used to be as rich as the United States a century ago in the early 1900s. Argentina was like one of the top 5 richest countries in the world a century ago. And now it's like middle of the pack. This is a country that should be a first world country that has like the standard of living of like Ukraine, which is in the middle of a war right now, right? And so the Peronists got voted out of power. Milei came in. And Milei is a through and through libertarian. And Trump is not. I will admit that. Trump is not. And I've also come out before recently and been like, I'm no longer a libertarian. And some people liked that. Some people didn't. But, you know, I still really like Milei because Milei represents, in many respects, what I believe in so many ways. Because here's what Milei did. He came into office and he's like, oh, the Peronists spent the last 50 years consolidating all this power in the hands of the presidency. I'm going to use it. And I'm not going to use it to expand the power of government. I'm going to use it to dismantle the power of government, right? Remember that.
So how many agencies did he shut down? Or
it was like a dozen.
It was insane.
Right, remember the
He just
whiteboard
did it
where he
day
was like
one,
ripping
gone,
all the
gone.
things? Like, I mean, he came out there and just, he took it and he campaigned on it with like a chainsaw, right? And he's like, we're going to just slash everything. And the thing is, he did an interview with, I think it was Tucker Carlson, and he talked about, look, the Gramscian long march through the institutions, that's real. And if we want to win, it's not about winning this election or that election. You have got to gut the agencies and institutions that are fueling socialism, that are fueling cultural
Marxism. Didn't he give
Marxism.
it as a warning to the U.S.
He
as
did.
well?
And I think Trump understands it maybe without the academic underpinnings that Milei, as an economist who is a through and through like Rothbardian libertarian,
You know, Milei
understands.
spoke at our CPAC, right?
Yeah, he did a great job at that too. I think Trump understands in some ways the same thing that Milei is doing, just not in the same like phraseology, right? So like Trump might not know who Antonio Gramsci is or what the Long March through the Institutions is, but he does know what those things are because he's been a victim of those things. He might not know, again, the specific academic components of those things like Milei does because Milei's an economist who's read all this stuff and studied all this stuff because he's a nerdy, geeky libertarian that revels in this type of stuff, whereas Trump is a businessman. So they have different backgrounds. And that's not a ding against Milei, by the way. That's a huge compliment because I'm also a nerdy, geeky person in the same fold. But the reason I bring this up is because I think Trump is going to do something similar to what Milei did, which is he now knows who the enemy is. Again, the enemy is not Joe Biden. The enemy is the managerial class.
Right.
The enemy is the bureaucracy. The enemy is the institutions that the left has captured. And the only way that we take back this country is if we dismantle those things and we replace them with institutions that push the type of values that we believe in as conservatives, that we believe in.
Do you think he's going to be able to do that, though?
I don't think he'll be able to do everything, but I think
he can't So in the U.S., it's a lot more strict on what the executive branch can actually do. Like, he can't just gut everything, can he? Can he just shut down a bunch of...
It's true that he cannot gut everything, but there's a lot that he can do. And this is where I want to bring up this thing called Project 2025. If you've heard of it, you've probably heard of the negative stuff about it because the left has painted this as, this is a fascist takeover. That's ridiculous. I'm not going to read through the entire thing because it's over 900 pages long, but I highly recommend that people who are watching this podcast or listening to this podcast take a look at it. It's called Project 2025. It was compiled by people associated with the Heritage Foundation. And don't get me wrong, there's stuff I don't like about the Heritage Foundation. There's other stuff that I do like.
I think overall they're the good guys.
It's worth noting that the Heritage Foundation did play a role with like pushing Trump to adopt more conservative justices, which is one of the greatest things he did while he was president, was appointing many justices, not just on the Supreme Court, but also in lower levels, that so far, by and large, have done a better job than previous Republican presidents, like George Bush, for that matter, let alone his father before him.
I think they all sort of had this mentality, like most people did, that partisanship shouldn't be in play in the judiciary or what. But now we all realize that you're partisan no matter what. So we better get some people that agree with us in there.
So I want to read the beginning of this. The very beginning, the introduction of Project 2025, which is an outline for things. Basically what they did was they compiled, it was, again, 920 pages. It was a list of all of the things that Trump should do if he gets into the White House. And it covers everything from taking the reins of government. They have a chapter on the White House. They have a chapter on the executive office of the President of the United States, central personnel agencies, and managing the bureaucracy. That's an important one because, again, the problem is the federal bureaucracy, the unelected federal bureaucrats that are overwhelmingly left-wing. And we know that because we live in Virginia, where most of these agencies are headquartered. They're not in D.C., They're headquartered in Northern Virginia. And most of the agency employees, most of the bureaucrats who work in these agencies live in Northern Virginia, and that's the reason Virginia became a blue state, was because the massive expansion of the federal government and the federal bureaucracy leading to Northern Virginia ballooning, zooming to the left at the same time that it blew up in size, and then taking over the state and overwhelming the rest of the state. This is a serious problem because it doesn't matter who the president is. The president can get elected, and the bureaucracy knows we can just wait this guy out, and he'll either be gone in 4 or 8 years.
And they don't even just wait him out. As we saw in his last term, they will sabotage at every turn and leak things and do everything else. So it's like having enemies within your ranks.
And again, Milei understood the same thing in Argentina. You are not going to defeat the left-wing Leviathan as long as the mechanisms exist to funnel more power, influence, and elite status to the left itself. And that's what all these agencies do. And it's also what all the institutions do, is that, again, they become left-wing gatekeepers, like I said earlier. And they use these things in order to push a left-wing narrative. So the way that you defeat the left is you dismantle these agencies, you dismantle the institutions, and you either replace them with nothing, or if you have to replace them with something, you replace them with something in a conservative mold. And so
I'm just hoping he goes in there and just fires almost everybody.
This outline, it continues with like Section 2, the common defense. They talk about the Defense Department, which is also a hotbed for left-wing. I mean, certainly in the context of the Defense Department and the Department of State and Homeland Security, that's like straight up left-wing globalism.
Oh, yeah. Typically the people on the left, when you're talking about the defense sector, are always the highest ranking.
Yeah, the military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower warned us about. Remember in the podcast where we talked about Ukraine and I asked the question of why are we spending $100 billion to queer the Donbass?
Yes,
so
I remember that.
I looked at how U.S. money is spent in Ukraine. You'd be amazed at how much money is spent on things like gender programs and promoting transgenderism and LGBTQ in Ukraine, a culturally conservative, Christian Orthodox country, far more conservative than the United States. And the federal government is tying things like military aid and foreign aid and financial aid to Ukraine to, you must adopt all of the wokeism that we have here. And I think a huge reason why conservatives have turned against support for Ukraine is because they know this is happening, even if they haven't seen the budget items. Mm-hmm. They know this is happening, and they're like, why are we spending money to defend a foreign country's borders 3,000 miles away from the United States when we have an open border here at home? And second off, why are we spending money to, again, queer the Donbass? I could understand the argument for defending a country that wants to ally itself more with the United States than with one of our enemies, but I don't understand why we need to tie aid to, again, some of this nonsense. Well, it's because these agencies push this stuff. So,
does that all stop under Trump? What does he do to these agencies, or what mechanism does he have to stop these agencies from doing these things?
So to answer that question, I want to briefly go through the rest of the section to show you like all the stuff that's in this conservative blueprint for what could be pushed if Trump gets into the White House. So Section 2 is about the common defense. It talks about the Defense Department, Homeland Security, the State Department, the intelligence community. These are all incredibly important things that the left has hijacked all of them. And then it goes on with media agencies, Agency for International Development, and then Section 3 is the general welfare, where it talks about all the other departments. So like agriculture, education, energy, the EPA, the Department of Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, the Department of the Interior, the Department of Justice, Labor, Transportation, Veterans Affairs. And then Section 4 is the economy. So it talks about the Commerce Department, the Treasury Department, Export-Import Bank, the Federal Reserve, which I'm going to get to in a little bit, the Small Business Administration, and then trade. And then lastly, in Section 5, it has independent regulatory agencies. So things like the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Election Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, federal regulatory agencies like the Federal Financial Protection Bureau, the Security and Exchange Commission. So there's a lot in here, right? Again,
Right.
It's 900 pages. But here's what the introduction has to say, which I think really drives home the point of what this is trying to do and why I think Trump is going to try to implement as much of this as he possibly can, because he knows what the enemy is at this point, even if he doesn't know the academic terminology in a way that an academic economist like Millay does. He still knows what the problem is.
Right.
And here's what the introduction has to say. It goes on to talk about it, how in 1980 there was something similar when Reagan got into the White House, and Heritage came up with a lot of stuff that Reagan ended up successfully implementing, especially on the financial side. But then it goes on to say it's not 1980. In 2023, the game has changed. They wrote this at the very end of 2023. In 2023, the game has changed. The long march of cultural Marxism through our institutions has come to pass. The federal government is a behemoth, weaponized against American citizens and conservative values, with freedom and liberty under siege as never before. The task at hand is to reverse this tide and restore our republic to its original moorings is too great for any one conservative policy shop to spearhead. It requires the collective action of our movement. With the quickening approach of January 2025, we have 2 years and one chance to get it right. Project 2025 is more than 50, and then it goes on to explain what it is, right? It's more than just this or that. It's a collective call to action for overturning the left's hijacking of everything that makes our country what it is. Because the reason that we're approaching the zombie apocalypse, the reason that Cthulhu's constantly swimming left, and the reason that the Leviathan keeps growing is because we're not fighting those things. Instead, we think that the fight is we need to win this election cycle.
Right.
No, the fight is not defeating Joe Biden and then we win and we go home. That's step one. Defeating Joe Biden does not dismantle the institutional capture. Defeating Joe Biden does not dismantle the federal bureaucracy. Defeating Joe Biden does not dismantle the long march to the institutions. You have to defeat Joe Biden in order to attack those things. And I think that Trump understands that now. So to give an example, like, here's one example within the chapter on the Federal Reserve. It talks about how this is a fantastic written chapter where it talks about some of the broad recommendations, like eliminating the dual mandate. So the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate where we want stable prices and low employment. But the problem is if you're using monetary policy to get stable prices, you're going to get high employment. And if you use monetary policy to get low employment, you're not going to have stable prices. So the Federal Reserve's dual mandate that Congress has given them is actually a contradictory dual mandate. You cannot, through monetary means alone, get both of those things. You can only get both of those things if you grow the supply side of the economy, not the demand side. You cannot subsidize demand in order to get both of those things. So, that's a positive thing. If you limit the Federal Reserve status as the lender of last resort, guess what that does? You're not going to get any more ESG scores on Wall Street because they won't have the option to go to the Federal Reserve to be the lender or buyer of last resort. Is it any surprise that you saw peak wokeism, peak ESG, the pinnacle of the absurdity of BlackRock tying things like equity, social and governance scores to things like loans and investments? Is it any surprise that all of that stuff happened at the same time that the Federal Reserve took the unprecedented step in 2020 of not just being the lender of last resort, but the buyer of last resort? Not just in the sense that they were the last resort for lending to banks that needed money or lending liquidity or buying treasury bonds in order to give Congress money, but they were going out there and onto the open market and buying corporate bonds. They were doing things that was similar to what the Bank of Japan did after the implosion of the Japanese asset bubble in the 1980s. Well, that's incredibly dangerous for two reasons. And libertarian economists correctly point out one reason, which is that you're creating perverse incentives within the economy to create these sort of adverse risk conditions in the future because Wall Street and the banking sector now both feel like we can get away with anything because if things go south, the Federal Reserve will bail us out because we're not allowed to have a correction. We're not allowed to have a recession because it's politically, it creates it's unadvantageous for us to have something like that politically. So we know that we can get away with this. Libertarian economists like Millay are correct to point out that first point. Increasingly, conservatives and libertarians, for that matter, now understand that it's also creating a second perverse incentive, which is that it funnels money to these institutions within mostly Wall Street and Silicon Valley, but not just limited to them, also within the banking sector in general. So not just the stock market, but also the banking sector, the real estate sector. It's funneling money to these things to then spend this money in a way that pursues left-wing ideological values. We are funding wokeism through the Federal Reserve. If the Federal Reserve didn't have the money spigot constantly turned on and was constantly pumping money into the system, guess what? BlackRock wouldn't have the money to tie everything to ESG scores. Silicon Valley wouldn't have the money to use DEI initiatives. There was a graphic that Microsoft put out recently where they literally bragged about how we are paying non-white employees more than white employees for the same position. That is not an exaggeration. They literally bragged about how it's like for every $1,000 that we pay a white employee for this position, we're paying a black or Hispanic or Latino or Asian or whatever, Indian, other minority group. BIPOC is the term that they use. Like we're paying them $1,000 and whatever. And for anybody that thinks this is a complete lie, I promise you, if we ever let us know if you want us to do a podcast on this where we can expose this type of stuff because it's out there in the open. Like these corporations, and yes, it's a violation of the Civil Rights Act. But guess what? White employees have found out that if they complain about this stuff, they get punished for it. And so most of them decide if they know that they're being discriminated against or held back or they're not getting equal pay, they just leave the job and go somewhere else rather than raise a fuss about it. Like that's the response that you're seeing a lot of white employees do, especially within Silicon Valley, but also on Wall Street. So, but the reason these corporations can get away with this, the reason that BlackRock or Microsoft or just Wall Street or Silicon Valley in general can get away with this is because the Federal Reserve has been pumping money into the stock market, into the real estate market, into all of what's called the everything bubble. And this excess cash has allowed these corporations to push left-wing wokeism and funnel money to left-wing ideological causes. Remember in 2020, during the Summer of Love, when the entire country was burning around us, you had corporation after corporation after corporation come out and be like, we're going to give $1 billion to BLM.
Right. So they could buy a bunch of rich houses.
Well, imagine if they didn't have the money in the first place and they had to choose between making payroll or funneling money towards wokeism.
Well, I mean, imagine the way to say it is imagine they didn't have the American taxpayers' pocket to dip into in order to do it.
That's a better way to put it.
Yeah. And so let me ask you this. What can Trump do to stop this? And then as soon as you answer that, I'm going to pivot us after that. Go ahead.
So there's actually a lot of power. Remember when I brought up the Millay thing, that what Millay did is that he went in and he was like, oh, you've consolidated all this power in the hands of the president? Well, guess what? The Peronists aren't the president anymore. I am. And I'm going to use this power not to grow the power of government. I'm going to use this power to dismantle everything that the left has constructed over the last 50, 60 years. I think that there's a good chance that Trump is going to try to do the exact same thing. Now, his motivations might be different. The way that he goes about doing it might be different. The way that he articulates it might be different because, again, he's not a libertarian economist.
Yeah, I think he'll have more of a revenge aspect to it, almost like you did me wrong, I'm going to do you wrong.
But you know what? The result will be the same,
if the result is good, we're happy,
The result will be the same insofar as he has been a victim of all of these institutions being weaponized against him. When he got into office, he was public enemy number one in the eyes of the Leviathan.
Yeah.
They did everything they could to destroy this man, to include throwing him into all of these lawsuits, some of which are totally frivolous, some of which they're trying to throw him in prison for, right? Like, they've threw the book at him. And if he survives this and gets into the White House, he's gonna wield the power that the left has accumulated in the hands of the presidency that we as conservatives have have pointed out for decades, you shouldn't be doing this. You shouldn't be doing this. Well, guess what? They did it anyway. And now if one of our guys gets in there, I think he's going to wield it. And I think he's going to wield it to try to dismantle everything that the left has constructed. Now, there's a danger in this. And Nick and I have had all of these discussions about it, especially where we use historical examples. There's a danger in this insofar as, does this create a Sulla situation? And so what I mean by this, and this is where the geeky historian side of me comes about. Nick and I have talked about this in our, about our like 3-hour conversations where we're just sitting in the living room chatting, right? Like, Nick and I are both fans of history, and we've looked at the late Roman Republic, and we kind of came to similar conclusions that, like, the Gracchi brothers did a lot of bad things, but they had legitimate grievances. Sulla did a lot of bad things, but he wasn't a bad person. So he did a lot of terrible things. Like, Sulla murdered his enemies because that's the way that you did things back in Rome. We're talking about pre-Christianity, right? So it's not the exact same thing, because I don't think that Trump's going to kill a bunch of people, and I don't think that Trump is going to go like full Gracchi brothers.
No. According to the left, he is going to commit mass genocide on, the LGBTQ community.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
By just denying their existence. Here's what I mean that's genocide.
Here's what I mean by you have a danger of a Sulla situation. So to give the very quick rundown, you had a crisis within the Republic after they defeated Carthage in the Punic Wars. Rome started to be disconnected from Romans itself. The Roman government started to become disconnected from the people that actually built the Roman state. Mostly the plebeians that had actually fought a lot of the wars that built Rome into what it was. And so you had the emergence of these different camps. You had the populares and the optimates. The optimates were kind of the elites. They were the champions of democracy, but they were also hypocrites, and they had created the problem. Whereas the populares had a lot of legitimate grievances, but they didn't know how to solve those other than, we need to get our guy in and he needs to just shake things up. And somebody like Sulla, he fought a bunch of wars. He fought one very famous civil war, and he won. And Sulla became a dictator. And so the left is probably thinking at this point, oh, Christians saying Trump's going to become a dictator. No, hear me out. Here's what I mean. Sulla got into office. He became a dictator. And I mean this in the actual Roman sense. I don't mean this in the 21st century American sense, because that was actually a term that existed at the time. He became a dictator, and what he did is that he purged everybody that he thought was breaking the system, and then he tried to reform everything in order to make sure that we would never go through this type of crisis again. And then he left. He actually kind of pulled a Cincinnatus, except he did a lot more, cracking some heads than Cincinnatus did. And he thought that he had fixed the problem. And so then when he voluntarily relinquished power and left, he thought, I've said everything right. The Republic will continue. And it didn't. Within one lifespan after Sulla, Caesar came along. And then Caesar kind of drives a dagger into the heart of the Republic. And then Caesar dies, and Octavian, his nephew, comes along and finishes it off and becomes the first emperor. And that's the end of the Republic. And the reason that those two men were able to do what they did was because of what Sulla did. What Sulla was trying to do was fix the problem, but inadvertently, what he did is that he actually created the circumstances through which the Republic would be destroyed. But that was not what Sulla's intention was.
So you think that's the danger?
I think that's
so
the
draw
danger.
your correlation between like how that could happen.
So here's what I mean. And also this could happen in Argentina. And Milei is not a dictator. And by the way, I don't think Trump wants to be a dictator either. I think that I genuinely think that Trump, again, he might not think this stuff out in the way that somebody like Milei does, but and there's many things that I disagree with Trump on, but I do think that Trump has this vision in his own mind of what he wants the country to look like. And it's not, again, it's not a fascist state. It's not a dictatorship. I think that he does want, he is an America first type of person in the sense that he wants what he thinks is best for America. It just so happens that what he thinks is best for America is not always what's best for America. But then again,
the
no single
correlation
person's
that you're
perfect.
drawing is in this, ancient situation, this guy was trying to fix everything, thought he had it fixed, but there were certain things that laid the groundwork for its eventual demise.
Yes.
How do you think that happens here?
So what I mean by that is Sulla came into office and then consolidated power in order to make all of these reforms that he thought were going to save the Republic.
So it's the consolidation of power.
But well, the power's already been consolidated, which is why I think Trump will be able to accomplish not
More.
all of this like 2025 project, but a lot of it, because the Democrats have been the ones that have won elections, consolidated power in the hands of the of Congress and the White House and the federal government in general, and specifically in the hands of the president and the federal bureaucracy, more so than anything else. Election after election after election is their response. Like, think about it. They spent 4 years saying Trump is a fascist dictator. Did they get into office in 2021 and say, man, we averted catastrophe. We now need to drastically reduce the power of the federal government to make sure somebody like Trump can never come along again? No, they didn't do that. Instead, what they said was, we need Build Back Better, and we need all this, we need more money and power and influence consolidated in the hands of Joe Biden, who's barely senile. Like, they don't understand that they are creating the circumstances of so they are the Sola in this analogy.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And
I
so
thought you were saying Trump
the
would
difference. The difference here is that Sola came in and then he consolidated power, tried to set everything right, and inadvertently set the stage without meaning to do so for the disintegration of the republic.
Okay, so
Whereas
you're
in our
equating-
case, the power's already consolidated. I think Trump will be the Sola, potentially come in, use the power that's already there to try to set the republic right. But the mistake that we could make, not Trump, the mistake that we could make is once he's done with that, however successful he might be, what we have to do, because he only has one more term left, what we would have to do is, if he's able to dismantle the Leviathan, if he's able to dismantle the bureaucracy, if he's able to undo the long march through the institutions, what we have to do next is we need to then dismantle the power that he will use to dismantle those institutions. Does that make sense? So
right.
Like Malay to use
So would
this,
that be done through Congress?
No,
or?
it would have to be the next guy.
Oh my gosh.
The next president.
But that's the fear. The fear is Trump gets in, he gets a ton of stuff done, and we don't win again because everyone's reeling from all the changes.
Because think about it like this. If, and Nick made this warning in the last podcast, if Trump gets if Trump gets in and then wields the power that already exists, that he didn't create, Democrats are the ones, again, that have consolidated all this power in the hands of the White House. Look at what FDR did. Look at what Wilson did. Look at what LBJ did. Those three men are the ones that have turned the presidency from being a very humble and modest position into being basically an elected monarch at this point. They're the three men that have done this, not Donald Trump. I want to make that abundantly clear. The Democrats have been the ones that have consolidated the power in the hands of the federal government, and in particular, the presidency and the bureaucracy. And Trump is going to be the man if he gets in, because you can argue he might be motivated by revenge, but it doesn't matter the motivation. He's going to try to dismantle these power structures.
So is it your opinion that he should wield every ounce of the power they gave him to do what he needs to do?
It exists.
Because on the right, let me just say,
he needs to
on
do
the
that.
right, we have a tendency to, here's an example, people on the right we want term limits. We like the idea of term limits. So you'll get people on the right who will term limit themselves, even though term limits aren't a thing yet. They're like, I'm only going to serve this many years because, I'm good.
And then somebody
this is my good
bad
thing.
replaces
And then
them.
someone bad replaces
Yes.
them. And so the question is, out of some sense of being magnanimous and above that kind of behavior, do we not wield this power all the way? Or should he wield the power?
So here's the danger. The danger is, this is where the left just totally flies off the rails. The danger is not Donald Trump. The danger is somebody who doesn't even exist yet, whose name we don't even know yet, that could become the American Caesar. Because we're at the Marius and Sulla stage of the Republic right now, or arguably the Gracchi stage. But the point is that we're at a point right now where somebody like Trump can come in and make a bunch of necessary reforms. And there were a lot of things that Sulla did that were good in terms of those reforms. I'm not painting him in a bad light. You have to understand that the way that Rome worked is different than today. What I'm saying is that the left is wrong when they think that Trump is Hitler or Mussolini or Caesar. He's not. He's potentially Sulla. And if that's the case, then we have it upon ourselves to make sure that once he finishes cracking heads and trying to right the ship, that we don't replace him with a Caesar, because he will only be there for 4 years. And I don't care what the blue and on woke, blue-haired, leftist resist people think. There will be an election in 2028 if Trump gets in. These people genuinely think that Trump will create a dictatorship
Well,
and we won't have elections
need to believe
again.
that. They need to believe that.
Like, they are totally delusional. The responsibility that we have is we need to support Trump in attacking the left's ideological capture of the bureaucracy and the institutions and tearing those things down. And once those are done and he has done his job and he's gone, that's when we need to make sure that we don't get a Caesar in after him.
Right.
And I don't mean in 2028. I mean potentially 20, 30, 40 years from now, because it'll be upon us to then draw down the power of the White House and the power of the executive branch and the power of the other things that he wasn't able to get done. But we've got to stop playing this ball game where the left takes power, uses everything that they possibly can against us, and then we come in and we say, we're not going to retaliate. No, we've got to retaliate. They consolidated all this power, and Milei did it. Imagine if Milei said, well, I don't believe the government should do anything, so I'm going to sit here and just let the train keep running in Argentina.
Right.
He didn't do that. Instead, he said, oh, you consolidated all this power in the hands of the president. I am now the president, and I'm going to use it to shut down all these agencies and eliminate all the subsidies and shut down all the state propaganda apparatuses that are pushing left-wing wokeism. And we're going to dismantle the socialist state that the socialists constructed. And I'm going to do it because I have the power to do it now. Trump has got to do the exact same thing.
I think he's in that mindset now. I think that his previous term, we all saw the whole lock her up. Remember all the chants? Okay. And then what did he do? He didn't do any of that. He totally left Hillary Clinton alone and didn't pursue any of that. I think we're dealing with a different dynamic now that he has been through the leftist, meat grinder. And I think he's like, okay, you know what? I was trying to be magnanimous last time. I was trying to be forgiving. I was trying to, be above all of that. This time, you're going to reap what you sow. And I kind of feel like he might actually do that. Now, I want to toggle over to a different aspect. So are you done with that analogy so I can do that?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So I want to kind of toggle back to Biden real quick, because you and I both, we really believe that Trump's going to be the one. However, a lot can happen between now and November. So many things. It's a lot of time. Shoot, at this time, last election cycle, we didn't even know about the coronavirus, right?
Well, it was actually this week, 4 years ago, that the whole country started shutting down.
That's right. Okay, so much can change because Trump was on the way to a victory back then, and pretty much shutting down the country was the only thing that could have stopped that victory, and it did, along with a lot of shady-looking stuff. So let's transition back over to Biden for a hot second, even though I really don't think he's gonna win. But we've got to kind of do some due diligence here, and I've got a really interesting question because if Biden wins again, obviously Kamala is the VP. I don't think she's going anywhere, her and all of her word salads and her cackling laugh and all of that. Okay, I don't know if you all noticed this, but Biden, you can just see him fading out. Like his eyes are looking distant. When you have friends and family that used to be, full of life, they were sharp as a tack, and, you went to them to glean wisdom. These were people that could give you the best advice. They were incredible, and they were kind of the life of the party, right? And as they enter this later segment of their life, you start to see the light go out, and you start to see their eyes just become distant. And you're wondering if they're really there. Are you catching all of this? Are you in your own, land somewhere? Where are you? And I feel like that's what we're seeing with Biden, because he was much sharper. He still had gaffes. He's always been kind of a gaffe machine, but he was much sharper 10 years ago, right? And he was sharper 4 years ago, even though arguably he was already dealing with whatever dementia stuff he's got going on. I mean, I really believe he has something undiagnosed, or maybe it's diagnosed and they're just hiding it. But Biden is fading away. You can see it in his eyes. So even if he, I don't think he's dying or anything, but I think mentally he is fading out. And I don't believe he can make it through a second term. I think he'll live through a second term, but I don't think they're going to be able to continue to hold him up like a puppet anymore. At some point, it's going to be too bad, and he's going to have to step down, or his family's going to have to make the decision for him, or whatever, right? Okay, so my question is, first of all, do you think he makes it through a second term mentally? And if you don't think he makes it through a second term, what do you think a Kamala Harris administration looks like for this country?
Answer to the first question is no. I don't think he makes it through a second term. So that was really short. Answer to the second question is, and I actually have an article here. A Kamala term in some ways will actually be worse than a Biden term because Kamala has no idea. She's in some ways worse than Biden, in part because she's actually to the left of Biden in many respects. Yeah. And Harris has fully bought into DEI, wokeism, ESG, all of that type of stuff. In part because, and this is going to be controversial to say, but she's a DEI candidate herself. I'm sorry, but she got to where she is and she's admitted it because she's exploited things like her gender and her race.
Right. Well, Biden said,
Biden said, I will pick a woman of color as my running mate. Not because they're the most competent, but because they're a woman of color. So we will have a DEI president through and through if Kamala Harris is in the White House. And anybody who's followed Kamala Harris knows she's not at all qualified to do anything.
She wasn't even qualified for her first big break. She only got the
Attorney General of California.
She only got the first big break because of her relationships.
Yeah, her relationships. I know exactly what you mean. But here's the thing. Harris, if you've been following her, she's big on the whole equity stuff. She's huge on the DEI stuff.
Well, it's benefited her.
I know.
Of course she's big on it.
What she's going to end up doing is she will sow the seeds for what I think is going to be, quite frankly, possibly inevitable at this point, but she might speed it up, which actually kind of brings us to the last thing that I wanted to bring up. But before I get to that, Harris has fully bought into the idea that equity is more important than equality. And that, she put out a video, I think it was during the 2020 campaign, where she was what matters is that we all end up in the same place. The amount of institutional power and, quite frankly, tyranny that you have to exert in order to get that outcome. Because, quite frankly, no two people are born the same. Not even identical twins are born the exact same way. You could take identical twins and they will have different outcomes in life. Why? Because they're not the same person. They have different passions and interests.
They make different choices.
Pursuits. They make different choices. Now apply that to society at large. There's a reason I'm not in the NBA, because I'm not 7 feet tall. I didn't start on the same playing field. So if you want equity, what? Are you going to shorten the height of the basketball hoop? It's absurd, this idea that only through state power can we have everybody end up in the same way. People don't end up in the same way for a multitude of reasons, because of biology, because of interests, because of the own personal choices that they make. And there's more than just that. There's so many reasons. There's an infinite variable of reasons why we don't all end up in the same place. And guess what? It's not a bad thing. It's not an oppressive thing that I'm not in the NBA.
So how do you think she'll wield that power? So you
know what she'll do?
You just spent time talking about how much power has been consolidated with the presidency. How do you think a President Harris would wield that power?
She'll do the exact same thing that every single Democrat administration or every single Democrat majority in Congress has done going back 100 years, going back to Woodrow Wilson. She will consolidate more power in the hands of the federal government, more power in the hands of the bureaucracy in the White House, more power in the hands of the presidency, which is the whole problem. Mm-hmm. This is the thing that conservatives are trying to been warning about. And this is why I'm voting for Trump this time around, and I didn't previously, because Trump knows that this is the problem, and he's willing to do something that no Republican before is willing to do, which is actually wield that. You know what he's going to do? He's going to wield the tools that people like Kamala Harris have given the presidency in order to dismantle the stuff that the left has been doing. But if she gets into office, because quite frankly, a vote for Joe Biden is a vote for Kamala Harris,
right,
because he will not serve a full second term.
I think that's why I think that's why Democrats are okay with him being the nominee, because they have her as their backup.
And then it'll actually help him in some ways, because then she'll be an incumbent in 2028 that could then run for another term herself, which helps because there's always that power of the incumbency, especially if you're a Democrat and you're able to wield the vast apparatus of the federal Leviathan in order to benefit your own campaign. Because think of the billions of dollars you can just dish out to try to buy votes.
The Biden administration's already doing that. Did you see the article where they're basically paying young people to, work polls and do all these, educational things, but they're paying them basically to vote
the
their
Tocqueville.
direction and get others to vote that direction.
It's the thing that Alexis de Tocqueville
But
warned us about.
they're doing it with tax dollars.
I know, that's
big
the
point.
problem. It's the thing that Alexis de Tocqueville warned us about, where he writes in Democracy in America that, democracy, and he wasn't like, this is a quote that's attributed to so many people, but like, the quote is basically that democracies cannot exist once the electorate realizes that it can vote themselves the public largesse, the treasury.
Right.
At that point, democracy just becomes mob rule with extra steps, and we're all out of steps at this point.
Right.
Nick actually did a Y Minute on why democracies have a pesky habit of destroying themselves. It's actually quite rare for a democracy to be crushed from the outside. It does happen every now and then. Like, look at what happened to Czechoslovakia when it got dismembered by Nazi Germany in 1938, or look at what happened to France in 1940 when it got steamrolled by the Wehrmacht. Like, there are examples. Finland with the Soviet Union in the Winter War, although they weren't conquered, they did lose. There are some examples, but they're quite rare, actually. Those are exceptions to the rules. Usually democracies don't get crushed from the outside. They destroy themselves from within. And he did this Y Minute where he talked about Athens, the first democracy, the most famous democracy of it all, the birthplace of democracy. Athens destroyed itself. And what they did is that they kept promoting demagogues who promised the public treasury or told people what they wanted to hear in exchange for political power. And one thing led to another until eventually Athens destroyed itself because it elevated a series of demagogues that decided we're going to pick a fight with the Macedonian Empire under Alexander the Great. And spoiler alert, that didn't go very well because they were fighting Alexander. And even after Alexander died, the army that he commanded was still alive. And so when Alexander died, Athens was like, now's our chance to get our revenge. And they didn't realize you're fighting a superpower that conquered the Persian Empire.
If you guys want to hear more about this, you can go on to YouTube. Christian started a, what was it called? King of Kings podcast.
I paused that.
And it was all about this.
We do have some other stuff in the works. And the Y Minutes talks about this. Anyway, without giving the history lesson, long story short, Athens destroyed itself. And Tocqueville and other people have warned about this is the crucial flaw with democracy, is when people end up being bribed with their own money by the very elected politicians that they're putting into office. And Kamala Harris embodies that. She will just feed the Leviathan. She will feed the bureaucracy. She will feed the left-wing ideologically captured institutions. And she'll just make the problem worse, which all that will do is simply hasten our rendezvous with ruinous destiny.
And because we're headed there no matter what.
And this gets to the...
Well, hold on.
Okay.
Before you do that, I want to ask the same exact question on the other side. Do you think Trump will make it through a second term?
Yes, I do think he will.
I think intellectually he's just fine.
I mean, there are people on the left that are trying to argue that he's slipping, and I mean, he's up there in age. He's like in his late 70s.
They don't have any right to talk about someone slipping with Joe Biden up there.
No, they don't. Well, what they're doing is they're coping. They're trying to say, oh, it's just a wash through the same because they're trying to mitigate Biden's weakness on that front.
But Trump has always been much sharper. Has a sharper wit. He's always been much sharper.
He's definitely sharper than Biden for sure.
He always has been.
I think Trump will serve a full term if he gets elected.
And even if he didn't, and we don't even know who a VP pick would be at this point. I don't even want to speculate. But no matter what, pretty much, I think we're in a much better situation on that side.
Yes.
Now, no matter who is elected, Christian and I both think we're headed for a specific result. And we kind of want to unpack that a little bit, and then we'll wrap up, right?
So, unfortunately, there's some things that will happen no matter who gets into office, which is part of the problem, right? So, like, here's a headline from Forbes. U.S. dollar death spiral crisis fears grow after Bank of America issues shocking $1 trillion every 100 days warning amid huge Bitcoin, Ethereum, and crypto price boom. So what this is talking about is, quite frankly, this. And this is the U.S. debt clock. Look at this big number right here. For those that are listening to us on audio only, the current, as of the recording of this podcast, the federal national debt is $34 trillion, $488,762,000,000. And probably by the time we're done with this podcast, it might be 780 million. So
Yeah.
it's every day the federal debt increases by $10 billion. $10 billion every day. Every 100 days, this is where the Forbes article comes into play, right? With the fear that Bank of America issued. Every 100 days right now, the debt alone is increasing by $1 trillion every 100 days. That's more than $3 trillion a year.
So
To give you an idea, when I was born,
Yeah.
when I was born 30 years ago, which is crazy to say that now. When I was born 30 years ago,
30?
I will be turning 30 in like 3 weeks.
Oh my gosh.
I know, it's crazy. Especially because I met you and Nick when I was in high school.
You were like 17 when we met you.
Yeah. It's been a while. When I was born in April 1994, the federal debt was like below $5 trillion. It was like 4 point something trillion. It might even be below that.
And it was a
that
big
mean?
issue back then.
Yeah.
Like everybody was
Because
freaking out
Clinton
then.
was campaigning on, I will cut the debt and we will balance the budget and
Well, he used to conflate debt and deficit and get people to think, oh yeah, look, I got rid of the deficit. But meanwhile,
debt
we
actually
still
grew
have
while he
all
was-
the
yeah.
debt. Yeah.
the debt actually did grow while he was in office. But part of the reason that they were able to balance the budget briefly was because there was a Republican Congress that
Right.
did that too. But point is that like the total amount of federal debt that existed, all of it for the 200 plus years of American history from Washington all the way up to Clinton, up to the point that I was born in 1994, the total amount of debt that had been accumulated through world wars, the Great Depression, terrible left-wing presidents like FDR and LBJ that massively expanded federal spending and everything, total increase in debt was less than 2 years worth of the amount of debt that we will rack up in the next 2 years.
Oh my gosh.
And
So what you're talking about now, you're talking about sovereign debt crisis.
yeah, here's an article from CNBC. The U.S. national debt is rising by $1 trillion about every 100 days. This is a disaster. This is an absolute
And
disaster.
I kind of think that this is a topic that is so in depth that we really could do a full other podcast on it. So let us know if you want us to dig
Yeah.
a lot deeper.
I just want to
But-
point out to people.
Yeah.
I mean, I won't show it, but like, there was a reason I was heavily buying crypto 2 years ago.
And he was just showing me his crypto stock and how he wishes he would have
I
purchased
wish I had
more.
bought more because I'm up like over 200% on Bitcoin at this
So
point.
so
But, like,
what does a sovereign debt crisis mean for our country in the briefest terms you possibly can give? And then we'll talk about like who's on the hook for this
Okay, so this is going to happen no matter who gets into office,
Right.
unfortunately. Biden, Trump, Harris, Trump's hypothetical VP.
do you think it
like,
happens slower under Trump?
Well, here's the irony, like, and this is a big criticism I had with Trump is that Trump printed money in 2020 as well. For
I think
COVID.
any candidate we have would print money. So that's just a wash at this point.
This is a bad thing. But remember when I also brought up that chapter on the Federal Reserve from the Project 2025?
Right.
The Heritage people realized that the current financial and monetary system that we have in place at the federal level is fueling the left-wing Leviathan that we have in D.C., in Silicon Valley,
So he
in Wall
could
Street.
take action to slow it down.
So there's a
it-
chance that Trump might actually go after this because he realizes that this is funding his enemies.
right.
And so it's actually in his own self-interest to try to right the ship. But here's the thing, at the end of the day,
It's
I
happening.
do think that this is going to happen no matter who's in office. Trump could try to do everything that Malay's doing. And Malay brought this up in his inauguration speech that like it is going to, there's nothing I can do to prevent it from getting worse before it gets better.
Yeah.
There's nothing I can do. Malay could get 100% of what he wants overnight.
Right.
And the situation in Argentina will still deteriorate before it gets better because there's
and
always
it's going
a delay.
To hurt. It's going to hurt. There are certain aspects of correcting this that are going to be painful. It's like a root canal. You have to go in, you got to get the root canal, and it's going to hurt like heck when you get it done, but once it's done, it's done.
Yes.
And so it's like, can the people handle the pain that it's going to take to get us on the other side of it.
So we are barreling towards a sovereign debt crisis. I cannot tell you when it will happen. I just can tell you it is almost inevitable that it will happen at this point. And we've done shows on this topic before. We probably at some point need to do another one in depth about it, where we have like an econ or monetary focused episode, and Nick can lay out using some of the stuff that he's talked about before about why this is going to happen and what you can do about it in particular. Because Nick really likes to not just, unlike me, he doesn't want to just doom about it. He wants to tell the audience, this is what you can do about it.
Well, this is why we're working on being resilient no matter what.
Yes.
But
the point is, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. And you know what? Trump is responsible for it partially. Biden is certainly responsible for it because he kept the money printers going after he got into office. He did not say, oh man, Trump printed all this money, we need to stop. No, he said, run it faster, baby. And that's why we have the inflation crisis that we had. It was not just because of Trump, it was because of both of them. And you know what? It's more than just Trump or Biden. It has been Republican and Democratic administrations for decades. It was Richard Nixon that took us off the gold standard, a Republican. It was George Bush that oversaw the bailouts in 2008.
Are you saying that,
and it was Barack Obama that did QE 2, 3, 4 infinity.
Do you think that whoever wins this next election, which is what we're talking about, do you think whoever that is going to have to contend with that sovereign debt crisis? Do you think whoever it is inevitably going to be the one whose shoulders it falls on?
I think it will potentially begin under them, but a sovereign debt crisis on the scale that I think is going to potentially happen might
take a while.
Might again, like in Argentina's case, it has been stretched out for like over a decade at this point.
Okay.
That Argentina has been going through this crisis where their money became worthless and inflation went through the roof, and literally the government itself went bankrupt, and the central bank in Argentina went bankrupt. Like, there is no money, as Milei said in his inauguration speech. There is no money.
Now we know that
took decades to happen.
We know that if somebody on the left gets in, they're never going to make cuts that need to be made.
They will make it worse. You know what they will do? They will do what the Peronists did in Argentina. They will run the money printers to just keep pumping money towards their allies and funneling status and influence towards their allies through the financial purse that the federal government can wield and the Federal Reserve can wield. They will just continue to pump money towards Wall Street and Silicon Valley as long as they parrot left-wing ideas.
Because they never talk about cuts. They never talk about reforming the financial
and they never will.
side of things.
And they never will because they have every incentive
their
to keep it going.
Their solution to everything is just to tax all the billionaires with 100% tax.
The Democrats will turn into Peronists, especially if somebody like Harris is in office. So it will get worse and it will be sped up, and that timetable of when it will happen will be shorter. If Trump gets into office, that timetable might be stretched out, which could be a good thing because the ideal optimistic scenario, and this is when we'll get into the closing here. The ideal optimistic scenario is that Trump gets into office, is able to wield that chainsaw and use the power that the Democrats have handed the presidency in order to push back against all these institutions that are, quite frankly, sucking taxpayer funds and then spitting it out towards their allies.
Right.
That's what all these agencies and institutions are doing. Through the financial mechanisms, including the Federal Reserve.
It's just basically massive money laundering on a federal scale.
Yeah, it's become a tax farm.
Yeah.
And if Trump guts these things, then we might have a chance of averting a sovereign debt crisis.
And I would say,
or at least delaying it long enough that we don't see, again, like some sort of complete economic catastrophe unfolding. Because that's when, remember the Sulla analogy?
Yeah.
That's when you get a Caesar. It's when the money dies. I mean, that is when things become very dangerous, because you want to talk about radicalization. People become radicalized when their money becomes worthless. In Germany, everything blew up. And you had twice. You had the hyperinflation in 1922 and 1923. Well, 1921 to 1923. And you had an actual attempted coup in Germany that almost succeeded. People forget about this, the cap putsch, because that wasn't the one that everybody learns about later on, right? And you also had the beer hall putsch, where the first time Hitler tried to take power, in part because of the economic woes. But then you had the Great Depression. You had the 1929 crash, and Germany was harder hit than almost anybody else because they were so heavily in debt. And the Great Depression was a credit crunch, which meant that the debt became worth more because it wasn't inflation, it was deflation. And so Germany went bankrupt and the economy imploded and unemployment skyrocketed and nothing could be done to fix it. Brüning, who was like the last bastion of trying to save the Weimar Republic, the last chancellor, well, okay, there were a few others that ruled for a very short amount of time after him, but the last chancellor of any note before Hitler tried to fix the problem and he couldn't. He did everything he possibly could, but it was just everything had blown up at that point. And more importantly, everybody became radicalized. And depending on where you were, people either went to the Nazis or they went to the communists. People leave that part out, that it wasn't just the Nazis. The German people were zooming to the political extremes in different ways based on their political leanings. And so the center collapsed. There weren't...
So do you think that what we go through will be similar to that?
If we go through a sovereign debt crisis, that we're not able to turn into a soft landing. I hate that phrase because the Federal Reserve uses it. But like if we go through like a hard sovereign debt crisis triggered by everything that Biden and Harris are pushing for, and quite frankly, the entire Democratic Party is pushing for, and as I will also point out, many Republicans in the past have also contributed to it. If we get that...
Right, but Republicans at least try to pump the brakes in certain aspects. Democrats never do.
If we get that, you will see a level of radicalization that's when you get a Caesar moment. That and I don't know who wins out. I don't know if
does that come from the left or from the right?
It could come from either. You could get either a Caesar or a Stalin. And we talked about that in the last time, Tina, that you and I did a podcast together where it was just us. Like Nick was, I can't remember. He was on some sort of business as a delegate. This was like in November.
Yeah. It was weren't we talking about men and women being at odds with each other?
No. Well, somewhat. It was about the left-wing civil war.
Oh,
and then we talked about how the revolution never ends on the left and it's just always marching to the left.
Yeah.
And they're radicalizing themselves. And quite frankly, like I brought up that, well, it's going to go in one of two ways. Like one of three ways. And we want the Cincinnatus route. We want the restoration of the republic. We want we want individual liberty. Like that's what we want. We do not want strongman authoritarianism. We don't want a fascist approach or a communist approach, because you will either get a Stalin situation where the left takes power, stops the veering to the left and solidifies the regime, the revolution right then and there. That's what Stalin did. He stopped the Russian Revolution. He completed it. Napoleon did the same thing. He stopped the French Revolution. He completed it. Oliver Cromwell did the same thing in England. He stopped the English Revolution. He completed it. And all three of those men made themselves the dictator from the left of the previous power structures that existed before. In Stalin's case, it was Nicholas II, the Tsar of Russia. And Napoleon's case, it was overthrowing the monarchy of France with Louis XIV. And in Cromwell's case, it was overthrowing the monarchy of England with Charles I. All three of those guys became strongmen and stopped the revolution, purged to the left of themselves, and solidified power right there. You could either end up in that situation, which is terrible because we do not want to be in a left-wing dictatorship, right? Or you end up seeing the right come back to power, and that's where the Sulla to Caesar pipeline exists, and we end up with an Augustus or Caesar type figure, but on the right. And we don't want that. We want Cincinnatus. We want George Washington, right? We don't want Augustus. We want Cincinnatus. And so our best chance of avoiding Caesar or Augustus, and certainly avoiding Stalin, because I definitely want to avoid that, right? Our best chance of avoiding that is we've got to dismantle all of these things that are contributing to the problem. The federal bureaucracy and the institutions that the left has captured, those are fueling the debt crisis. Those are fueling the constant lurch to the left. They're fueling the left-wing revolution where it's just always, everything's to the left of where it was yesterday. Everything is to the left of where it was 5 or 10 years ago, right?
So
the way that
according
you
to
stop
Christian,
that is you dismantle these things.
And if we don't dismantle it, we're doomed.
If you don't dismantle it, we will end up with either a Napoleon or Stalin-like figure, or a Caesar or Augustus type figure.
And Christians are operating off of the idea that history basically repeats itself.
And I know that our listener Andrea is like listening to this and be like, I totally disagree with you. So here we'll end on the optimistic note to try to emulate Nick here. Okay.
Okay.
So I don't think it's inevitable that we end up with, Stalin. I don't think it's inevitable we end up with Caesar. I don't think Trump's a dictator. I I genuinely think that his motivations might be slightly different, and he might have different ways of communicating what he wants to do than somebody like Milei. But I do think that we have a unique opportunity, the first time arguably ever, where the Republican nominee knows who the enemy is, and the enemy is not Joe Biden. The enemy is the left's Leviathan, the entire thing, and how they use the federal government, but not just the federal government, in order to consolidate or in order to acquire and consolidate more power.
Right.
And we have an opportunity to put somebody in the White House that will actually fight back against those things and do everything he can to dismantle those things. And if he does his job, then we will have an opportunity in the next 4 years, because he can't run again, to then get somebody else into office that will then finish the job and put us back on that track towards the Cincinnatus type figure. I think that we have a chance, and I've doomed about this a lot for the past year, but the fact that we got somebody like Milei in Argentina is proof. And the fact that it was like yesterday.
Proof that it can be done.
The fact that it was yesterday in San Francisco, not exactly a bastion of red-pilled right-wing conservatism,
Right.
they passed 3 referendums that actually reverted some of the woke nonsense that they had been pushing over the last few years.
Yeah, they voted overwhelmingly on ballot
like-
initiatives for basically
to like crack down on you breaking into cars,
dealing
and,
with crime,
criminalizing and robbing stores,
and the homelessness too.
and to like reinstitute algebra. Now I know this sounds ridiculous. They're like, whoa, we're cheering on, San Francisco voters for bringing back algebra. That year, yes, that really goes to show you that the hour is late, my friend. Like we are
Yeah.
in the end game here. But the fact that a place like San Francisco could take a tiny step, but a tiny step
they're
away from the
starting
ledge.
to wake up. It's an indication that they're starting to
And
wake
the fact
up.
that a country like Argentina that elected socialists and wokeists to office for decades, then reverted and elected the most based libertarian ever. And he's done so, like, it gives me hope that we can do the same thing here. And I don't think it's inevitable that the right is going to ultimately conclude that the only way we win is if we just seize power and create a strongman dictatorship, or the even worse situation, which is that we end up with a Stalin type figure on the left. I don't think those are our only options. And for a long time, I was worried about that. I do not think, to quote Nick Land, that the arc of history inevitably bends towards zombie apocalypse. I think there's a chance that we could avert the zombie apocalypse. But you know what? It's probably going to be uglier. It's going to get worse before it gets better. But if we take the right steps now, and we know who the enemy is, and we know what we need to do to push back against it, to avert that catastrophe, I think we can actually save the American Republic and not result in the solo option of inadvertently destroying the American Republic. So
Right.
that's what gives me a little bit of hope. But we're running out of time, and we've got to start tackling the problem at the source.
Yeah. And I would also add in there, and that's on a governmental level, but when you're looking at some of the things we talked about today, it can really kind of instill some fear in people. When you talk about sovereign debt crisis and like things collapsing, people start really getting pretty nervous. And I would just say that, there are a lot of old methods and old things that you might want to go ahead and make yourself resilient for. Learn how to grow food again. Learn how to learn how to deal with animals that can produce food and things like that. And I know that we always kind of push everything back to the homestead side of things. And I know that some of this can be parodied a little bit. Homesteading has become a little bit of an aesthetic now for some people, but I don't think that's the majority. I think a majority of people are really trying to get back to how do we become more resilient as our own family unit so that we're not depending on what the government does and does not do. If you're able to grow food and you're able to feed your family, you're going to be okay. And you can do it on a very small patch of ground, a very small patch. And so I would just encourage people get your skill levels up to par. It's going to be a learning curve, but in order to shore this up, because I agree with Christian, I do think we are headed toward a sovereign debt crisis, whether it's in 5 years or 10 years or what, or if it's like a progression toward it or through it. I am saying you're not going to regret learning how to do these things. And I'm not a big prepper type person. I don't think you should be filling your basement with, food. You know how all the conservative media people are like, get this bucket of freeze-dried food and, all this stuff. I'm not really actually a fan of all of that. I'm a much bigger fan because that will run out eventually. I'm a much bigger fan of you getting some chickens, learning how to raise chicks and incubate eggs and, have your own meat source.
Cultivate skills.
Yeah.
Hedge your bets, right?
Grow some vegetables. I mean, you can grow wheat. There are things you can grow on your own land.
There's also things you can do even if you're not like in a rural place where you can homestead. Again, like
you don't even need 10 acres to do most of this stuff you can do in a backyard, in just a pretty modest backyard. You just can't have, a bunch of grass. It's got to be gardening.
The biggest piece of advice that I can give people is like cultivate skills, hedge your bets. Like one thing that I'm doing, and I'm not going to like recommend that everybody do it, but like I brought up earlier that like I bought a whole bunch of cryptocurrency because I thought that we could go in this direction. And like obviously it's extremely volatile, so it's not like I recommend dump everything you have into Bitcoin, right? I'm never going to recommend that to people, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not going to give financial advice, let alone that type of financial advice. But the point that I'm trying to bring up is that like if you know that this is the direction that we're going, like there's things that you can do beyond just voting for Trump. I highly recommend that you do vote for Trump. And I say this as somebody that did not vote for him previously because I think I know, or I think that he knows what the problem is and who the enemy is and what needs to be done in order to push back against them.
He's very financially minded. I think if anyone who has been a president, in recent, in the last 50 years, Trump understands money.
But there's more than just, you can do so much more than just voting for Trump or voting against Biden in order to make yourself more resilient, right? This is the whole thing that Nick has emphasized in shorts and on whole podcasts. Like he's talked about this at length, and I know that he will continue to talk about it at length. I'm willing to bet that we will do an episode after the election, win or lose, where he's going to be like, here's what you need to do now that all the ballots are counted, right? And so anyway, I think we'll wrap it up there, but I'm actually mildly optimistic for once that we can avert the zombie apocalypse and that we can avert some sort of strongman dictatorship from either the left or the right.
Everyone mark your calendars. I'm pretty sure this is the first time I've heard him say he's mildly optimistic.
I'm still pessimistic about the whole debt crisis and stuff like that. But I think Argentina and what happened recently in San Francisco is a sign that it is not inevitable that we just, kill ourselves democratically.
Right.
And so, and if we can avoid the zombie apocalypse, if we can avoid, the catastrophe that for so long I've feared awaited us, then there's a chance that we don't end up in either of those places. And, that's the last thing I want to leave with, because Nick and I have talked about how, at some point we need to do a podcast about how the woke will lose no matter what. No matter what, they will lose, no matter what the outcome is, or who wins in the end, or who's left standing, or how this plays out. Wokeism is going to lose, and we will explain why. And some of these scenarios are a lot more sobering than others, where it's like, great, our enemies lose, but we also lose. And some are great, where it's like nobody loses other than the woke idiots that want to dismantle everything that we hold dear. But no matter who wins in the end, the wokeists will lose, because guess what? If we win, they lose. But even if they win, they lose, because I don't think there's any type of Stalin-esque regime that would ever tolerate wokeism. Like if there's one history with left-wing, regimes, is that they usually purge their own, right? The revolution eats its own.
And they're not breeding. Well, they are breeding, but they're not letting them live. So it's definitely the problem. Basically, we have to wait them out.
Well, it's not just wait them out.
They don't care about the families, so they're not really making families.
It's that we need to break down the things that are being used to indoctrinate people into leftism, which again goes back to targeting the bureaucracy, targeting the institutions, do things like homeschool or private school your kids. Like That's the mechanism that we need to go about. It's not just about beating Joe Biden. It's about beating the entire system and replacing it with one that enshrines our values and principles. And those values and principles are the things that made America great in the first place.
Right. So let's make America great again, guys.
So let's make America great again.
Oh, you're so MAGA. You're so MAGA.
All right. This has been fun.
Thank you guys so much for joining us. I'm sorry Nick wasn't here with us today. He will be back next week, and we got a little bit of travel going on coming up. But we are going to definitely have Nick back in the studio, so that will be great. I love the fact that I get to look at him across the table, and I will get to look at him across the table again. He'll be back from Richmond, and he'll probably tell you guys all how it went. But thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next episode.
And thank you for Good Ranchers for sponsoring this. Go check out goodranchers.com. Use promo code Nick at checkout, and there's some fantastic deals for you there.